I'm getting hungry. Wife, do you want to cook out tonight? Send. No, what? Do you want to do it tonight? That's not even close to being an autocorrect. Yeah, sure, come here. Sometimes being lucky isn't always a bad thing.
Yeah. Analytics, off the chain, all the channels, not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game. I'm a headliner.
Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to the Fantasy Headliners. Kyle here to talk about some of the luckiest wide receivers during the 2021 football season. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, being lucky isn't necessarily a bad thing. So this video is in no means telling you not to draft these guys or to avoid them on draft day. Simply a video going over why three of the top wide receivers from 2021 may have been a little bit on the lucky side, whether or not some of that luck will transfer to 2022, and what kind of that outlook is. So this is going to be a good video, a fun video to kind of go over some of those interesting stats that we find throughout the offseason. But just a reminder to everybody, we are hard at work behind the scenes right now on our fantasy football draft guide for the 2022 NFL season. And you could pre-order yours right now at the link down below. Or what if I told you you could just get it for free? That's right. Our friends over at Prize Picks are sponsoring the draft guide this year. And if you're interested in getting yours for free, all you got to do is head over to prizepicks.com or download the Prize Picks app. Create a new account using the code word headliners and deposit $20. They're going to match your deposit, and then when our fantasy football draft guide releases in July, we will send you a free copy. So make sure that you go do that right now over at Prize Picks. Again, create that free account, code word headliners, deposit $20, and you're going to get yourself a free 2022 fantasy football draft guide from us here at the Fantasy Headliners. But enough is enough. We got to hop into who is one of the luckiest wide receivers from the 2021 season. And the first guy up saw some luck last year. And I hate to tell you, I don't know what to think of his 2022 outlook because things have greatly changed on his team. And the man that I'm talking about first is going to be wide receiver for the Seahawks, DK Metcalf. Woo! Going from Russell Wilson to Drew Lock is going to be one heck of a downgrade this year. Now, I will tell you, I was a little bit of a Drew Lock believer at one point in time. Maybe I still think he's decent enough to get the job done, but he's no Russell Wilson, so I think it's pretty safe to say that we could see a change in Seattle this year, back to some of the old ways where it's focus on the run game, really make sure you establish that, have a good defense, and then throw the ball when you need to. So some of DK Metcalf's stats could end up coming down this year, but what made him lucky last year? Well, he ended up finishing as the wide receiver 12 last year, so came in as a wide receiver 1, but there were a few stats that just don't bode well for week over week consistency that we would like to see from a lot of our fantasy football starters. First of all, 7 of the 12 touchdowns that he scored last year all came over the course of 3 games. If you remember, he really had like 3 big games last season where he put up decent touchdown numbers, a 3 TD performance and 2 touchdown performances. So over half of his touchdowns came over the course of 3 games. Great. Big games, right? Well, then that leaves, some little performances the rest of the year that you have to try and work through. And one thing that just doesn't seem to really bode well for DK Metcalf is the fact that he only had 1 game last year with 100 or more receiving yards. Normally, when you look at top 12 wide receivers, they're going to have multiple games where they had more than 100 receiving yards. Last year, DK Metcalf had 1 game where he had more than 100 receiving yards. Again, some big performances, but then a lot that was left to be desired for all of the other performances. He was also the only wide receiver that finished in the top 23 of fantasy football scorers that had less than 1,000 receiving yards. Ladies and gentlemen, you read that correctly. Of the top 23 wide receivers from last season, DK Metcalf was the only one that didn't have 1,000 receiving yards. And to add a little insult to injury there, not only does that stat maybe boggle your mind a little bit, but he was also only one of 2 players that did score 10 or more touchdowns last year to have less than 1,000 receiving yards. The other one, Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings. Not really the same player, right? Kind of different in terms of how their game styles play out. But DK Metcalf last year, man, if you owned DK Metcalf last year, let me know in the comments how much Pepto-Bismol did you have to take? Because I have a feeling that he was causing some nasty heartburn for owners last year. Just looking at the numbers again, and we talked about it at points last year where DK Metcalf was extremely inconsistent at times. But how did it feel being a DK Metcalf owner? And now we're moving into a situation where he has Drew Lock as his quarterback. It's going to be interesting to see where DK Metcalf ends up in terms of the consensus rankings and ADP goes this season. For me, going to have to back him down into the wide receiver 2 category. I don't think I can put him into wide receiver 1 category because, again, super inconsistent last year. Different quarterback situation now. It's just one of those things where it's super, super tough to look at because he is very, very talented. I would love to see him in a much better situation. And it could end up happening. Seattle could really trade him conceivably at any point, considering how many people we've seen traded over the last few months, especially at the wide receiver position. Now, another guy who maybe you take a look at and say, lucky, the wide receiver 2 last year, Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel did run into a little bit of luck last year. Now, I love me some Deebo. I even did a video last year telling y'all to go get Deebo Samuel because I liked his chances at a bounce back. So I'm going to take that as a win, okay? So don't hate me when I say that he was probably still a little lucky last year in some areas. Now, why was he lucky? Well, Deebo Samuel finishes the wide receiver 2. Great season last year. But he had the fewest receiving touchdowns of any top 12 wide receiver in fantasy points. He only had 6 touchdowns last year, receiving touchdowns. For a guy to finish as the wide receiver 2 and have less than double digits receiving touchdowns is crazy to think about, especially if you look at some of the top performers over the last several years and what their numbers look like. And why was that? Well, it was because Deebo Samuel had 8 rushing touchdowns last year, which were the most for any wide receiver in a season in NFL history. Deebo Samuel's year last year was something we had never seen before as football fans. He was utilized correctly by the San Francisco 49ers. And here's part of my concern with that. Is Deebo going to be utilized the same way again? Earlier in the offseason, I would have told you, yeah, for sure. But now we've kind of hit a point with Deebo where there was some animosity. There was some back and forth between him and the 49ers, okay? At one point, it was, I want a new contract, and San Francisco was willing to give him one. But then he made apparently some comments about not wanting to be utilized the way he was last year and just wanting to be more of a prototypical wide receiver. And then there was talks of him being traded because he didn't want any deal with the 49ers. He just wanted to be moved out. The draft came and went. They got solid offers, better offers than some of the other top wide receivers in the league got last year. And he's still in San Francisco. Now, could that change at any point in time? Yeah, it could change. Absolutely. Will it? As of now, probably not. Because again, I don't think San Francisco is going to be getting anything close in trade offers to what they got right before the NFL draft. I mean, it was even documented that the Lions offered a first and a third for him. So are you going to be getting first and thirds? I mean, if you do, it's for 2023, but we're a little bit of ways off from that. So I don't see Deebo Samuel now being traded at this point. Just don't think it's going to happen. So will he be utilized the same way? Part of me says yes, that in some capacity we'll see that. But also keep in mind that the San Francisco 49ers dealt with a lot of injuries at running back last year. And that was part of the reason that they did have to utilize Deebo Samuel the way that they did, because they just had trouble getting guys out onto the field on a regular basis at the running back position. So they were looking for ways to get creative. They did that with Deebo, and it worked out really, really well. So now, looking ahead to this season, will that continue? Some of it, yes, but not all of it. Replicating 8 rushing touchdowns probably isn't going to happen. One stat that is a little concerning, but not enough to scare me away. He led the league with 12 drops last year. All right. You don't want to see that out of your top, your top weapons, especially if Deebo were to move away from that type of a format or that type of a usage where we're looking at him more as a true wide receiver and not this all-around player that he was last year. He's not a gadget player either. I've seen a couple of people say gadget with him. No. He's a weapon. He's a weapon. He's not a gadget player, okay? Leading the league with 12 drops. Got to clean those up a little bit, especially if we do move away from that weapon usage that we saw last year, and he's conceivably going to more of just a wide receiver type of role. But again, we are not passing on Deebo Samuel this year because of that. We just have to make sure that we do build in some of those things when you talk about his ADP and his value for this year. Because if people are drafting him as the wide receiver 2 off the board, it's going to be hard for him to replicate those numbers. Moving on to Mr. Consistency at the wide receiver position, Mike Evans, the most 1,000-yard seasons to start a career consecutively. Every season that he's been in the league, 1,000 receiving yards. Now, we have known Mike Evans to be a little bit on the lucky side during his career based on some of those numbers, but last year may have been one of the more luckier seasons that we've seen. The wide receiver 8 last year in half PPR formats, he had the second fewest receiving yards among the top 15 wide receivers, second to only, you guessed it, DK Metcalf. Also, he had the third fewest receiving yards of any wide receiver that had 10 or more touchdowns. So again, kind of the same thing that we saw with DK Metcalf that we're seeing with Mike Evans. A lot of the value that we saw from Mike Evans last year was built around his touchdowns. It's hard to chase touchdowns consistently in fantasy football because touchdowns aren't normally going to be a repetitive stat. And by that, when I say repetitive stat, I mean things that are easier to replicate on a year-to-year basis, depending on your situation. Targets, if you're a good player, receptions, receiving yards. Those are all things that are a little bit easier to replicate on a year-to-year basis. Things that are not as easy to replicate, finding the end zone. You've got guys that can find the end zone on a consistent basis and do well at it, but it's a stat that's hard to chase year after year because there are guys that they're just not going to hit it. They're just not going to hit that part, all right? 13 of his 14 receiving touchdowns, which 14 was second most in the league last year, were scored in the red zone. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Red zone, 20 yards out from the goal line. A lot of your touchdowns are going to be scored from the red zone anyway. But it is a little bit of a downgrade where we've seen some bigger plays, some bigger touchdowns from Mike Evans in the past. Mike Evans has been a guy that has been able to win deep in the past and do it with touchdowns outside of the red zone. And last year, all but one of his touchdowns were scored within the red zone. So some of those really big plays from Mike Evans that we used to see in the past, they disappeared a little bit last year. And some people might say it's because of Tom Brady and he just doesn't have it anymore. And I don't necessarily think that's true. But with Mike Evans, a little bit of that luck factor there where we lose some of those big plays, but he was able to make up for it. And the red zone is a big receiving weapon. Now you get Chris Godwin back. You lean on Leonard Fournette a little bit more. Now all of a sudden you've got Russell Gage there as well. We have yet to hear about whether Rob Gronkowski will be back. Add all these things together, there's going to be a few more weapons that if everyone stays healthy that are going to be available. When is Chris Godwin going to be ready though? We don't know that for sure yet. And last season, this is the big one, and I don't like to see this one because these are the type of weeks that will lose you weeks. He had 6 games where he had 3 or fewer receptions. Everybody has a bad game every once in a while, right? Yeah, it happens. Over a quarter of your year, though, you only have 3 or fewer receptions. If you don't have yourself a big-time touchdown in that game, you're scoring less than 10 fantasy points. And in a half PPR league, if you're scoring less than 10 fantasy points as a wide receiver, you're probably doing some damage to your owners. And that's an issue for Mike Evans. That's the consistency there that we need to see cleaned up this year. If Chris Godwin isn't ready to go to begin the season, more than likely you'll see Mike Evans, like as we saw in the playoffs last year, where the dude had like 30 plus targets, had like 20 receptions, absolutely on fire. I think he had close to 300 receiving yards over the 2 games. You know, you put together weeks like that with no Chris Godwin, that might happen to start the season. But as soon as Chris Godwin comes back, as soon as Russell Gage gets a little bit better and a little bit more consistent in the game plan, if Rob Gronkowski comes back, we're going to, those weeks could be a little bit, further in between when you see 6 games again with 3 or fewer receptions. Don't love to see that. But again, I'm not going to not draft Mike Evans because of any of these things. Mike Evans is a beast. From an overall career standpoint, Mike Evans has been one of the most consistent wide receivers that we've ever seen to start their NFL career. So, hey, luckiest wide receivers in 2021? Maybe, maybe not. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about each of these wide receivers from last year and whether or not you plan on trying to target any of them or all of them come draft day this year. You got to hit the like button for me. And as always, if you're new here to the Fantasy Headliners, you got to subscribe. You got to become a part of Headliner Nation and check out all of our content as we're starting to crank things out now. This is the time of the year where you're going to start to see daily videos getting closer and closer and closer. And it's exciting because football is getting closer as well. Appreciate everybody stopping in today to check out this video. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game. Y'all stuck on 3rd down. Your content's plain Jane. Headliners on top now. We gonna move and change. Podcast off the rip. Draft guide, so legit. Fantasy world, our game tight. You know we about that Chubb life. Stuck in a rut and you need some motivation. Head to the channel for this Headliner Nation. I'm a headliner.